Staff at regional offices extracted the files of those beneficiaries with Greek-sounding names who were receiving a sickness benefit or invalid pension. If the file contained medical reports of psychiatric or nervous disorders or referred to any of the doctors under investigation, they were singled out. Staff were also given a sample of Demos's handwriting to see if it corresponded with the writing on the application forms. If a file matched any one of these criteria, it was sent to police headquarters.
There was no evidence to the department's knowledge of some sort of racket. It was an investigation being conducted by the Commonwealth Police.
Thomas identified over 1,000 patients who he claimed were involved in the alleged fraud ring. Those with psychiatric illnesses came under the strongest suspicion. Now, there was nothing in these files to show that these people weren't entitled to their benefit payments. There was nothing to show that they were part of a conspiracy. In fact, there was nothing in here to show that any conspiracy existed. The only thing these beneficiaries had in common was that they were Greek-born and had seen one or more of the doctors who were being investigated. Yet the police insisted that 99% were faking their illnesses, even though there was no medical evidence to support this claim.
After the files were separated and we then started to surveil people because of the allegations that they were actually working. We didn't have enough time in 3 months to do proper surveillance, so that it was a case of one morning if we clicked on a particular person, that was okay, but we just had to leave him then and go on to the next case. So it was very much a superficial surveillance, but it was very successful in what they did do.
Superficial is the operative term. None of the material from the surveillance when it was presented in the court showed anything other than these people picking their children up from school or coming or going to the doctors. Very, very few instances would show a beneficiary who was actually working, and this was perhaps one out of hundreds.
There's no doubt that, as in every community, there were a few people who were cheating the system and giving genuine beneficiaries a bad name. But these people are normally dealt with by the Department of Social Security and not by the police.
Yeah, Social Security has its own internal method of dealing with beneficiaries who are claiming payments to which they're not entitled to. For example, if someone is found to be working, generally the offenders are simply required to just pay back whatever money they shouldn't have received. So their offence is just a breach of the Social Security Act.
But in this case, the police did not let Social Security deal with these few offenders that they detected. They continued to insist that a massive conspiracy was at work within the Greek community and planned to arrest the 1,000 patients whose files they had obtained.
My plan was, and it was approved by the Commissioner, and I was led to believe at the time by the Minister, that we would charge everybody at the time with conspiracy, that we would then select from those persons charged those people who had confessed and whose evidence could be used if they turned Queen's evidence, so that we were going to then withdraw all the conspiracy charges and proceed with those persons charged with statutory charges under the Social Security Act. That would then allow us to, after selecting our best confessions, to have those people be given an indemnity. They would give evidence against the various doctors, because it was the doctors we were after. The beneficiaries could be dealt with normally.
Well, Inspector Thomas's plan sounded a little bit like a conspiracy of its own. What he was saying he was going to do was to charge 1,000 people with conspiracy and then withdraw the charges. That's like assassinating 1,000 people so that he could get half a dozen or so. It was just a massive fishing expedition.
This, then, is why so many members of the Greek community were arrested for conspiracy. Not because there was evidence to implicate them in any sort of racket, but because the police planned to use them as pawns to be sacrificed in the prosecution of the doctors. On the last weekend in March, the police launched into Operation Don's Party and began gearing up for the mass arrest of the doctors and their patients. plainclothes officers at Sydney International Airport were placed on special alert in case any suspects tried to leave the country.
Yes, I remember that morning very, very well. In actual fact, it's a morning that I'll never forget. I went out onto the veranda around about 8 o'clock, and I then saw 4 of the biggest guys I've ever seen starting to walk up our driveway. I looked over and very jokingly said, "This looks like an invasion." And he looked up at me and said, "Madam, you may be right."
Does Dr. Nicholas Casamatis live here?
Yeah, sure. Can I ask who's calling?
Commonwealth Police.
Nick, Commonwealth Police to see you.
Yes, well, when my wife told me the police were here, my first recall is when police come to a doctor's house. Usually it's got something to do with one of my patients. So I quite nonchalantly approached the door, and instead this policeman said very officially that he had a search warrant to search the house, and that I was under arrest for defrauding the Commonwealth Government. So they searched high and low, going through the house, under the house. I was a bit confused, and they were saying very little more than that when I tried to clarify what the charges were or with whom, and they just weren't forthcoming.
Look, I'm making tea or coffee. Would anyone like some?
No.
I didn't know anything about search warrants or anything like that, so I had no idea what was happening, what was going on. They were just looking through anything, for anything, but I didn't know what, and I don't know if they really even knew either.
That's the kids' bank book.
It was the morning and I was sitting here examining a patient sitting in the chair, and my secretary buzzed me on the intercom and said there were some police who wanted to see me. So I said, sure. I thought it was some routine matter. Asked them to wait a minute and I'll be out. But they didn't wait. The next thing, the door burst open and in they came with the patient still sitting here with his shirt off. And then they proceeded to search the place and to seize every bit of paper in the building. Eventually, within a couple of days, they sent back photocopies. They did send us back a few originals, some cards of patients who were obviously not Greek, with obviously English names. And the crazy thing was that some of those were in fact Greek because they changed their names and they had English names. But apart from those few, they took the lot and they still have it. They still haven't returned these documents. We're still waiting for them to come back. The patient's confidential medical records are still in the hands of the police.
Dr. Dinnan was conducting a group therapy session when police raided his consulting room. These sessions were a regular part of the treatment that he provided for his Greek-born patients and were designed to help them cope with their psychiatric problems.
Yes, gentlemen.
The thing that outraged me at the time was the fact that I was in the middle of treating patients and that the police were obviously interested in that treatment, in their idea that this was part of some scheme. And I spent 10 minutes with them trying to deal with this issue about whether or not they had any authority or any permission from me to interview my patients. That discussion was preempted because after 10 minutes or so it was obvious that the police had gone into the room and were taking people out and were taking them out to what I saw a few minutes later was a white paddy wagon. I've always considered that to be the most outrageous breach of doctor-patient confidentiality that I know of. I've written about it and compared it with the sort of outrage that was created years ago when abortionists were arrested while their patients were anaesthetised on the operating table.